go to the other part of our mixture. And we're going to talk about a little bit of history. We're going to talk about the American Revolution very soon, but it's connected with the French Revolution. So we're going to start with the French Revolution. So, so what I'm going to talk about is the fiscal institution of the regime that preceded the revolution, tell you a little bit about the revolution. And the French Revolution, which occurred between 1789 and 1799, depending on how you look at it, fulfills our dictum, Milton Friedman's dictum, that fiscal crises sometimes or often are resolved through political revolutions. And this is Exhibit A in this. Okay, so to tell you about the French Revolution, I think I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about the British Revolution that occurred earlier. So in the Britain had a revolution called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It sets a stage. Britain, in the mid to late 1600s, is a weak country. It's about a half to a third the size of France. It has a king that is at odds with the parliament. The king defaults a lot. The king the Stuart kings they had trouble borrowing because they did things like require forced loans. They would sell monopoly rights, and then the next year they would sell duopoly rights in the same industry, and the next year they would sell oligopoly rights. They had a bad record of paying their loans. If you had a loan against the King of England, you had to enforce it in a special court that always decided in favor of the king. So the consequence was during the Stuart regime of before 1688, Britain had a government that had limited power to borrow, and it was a weak country. Essentially, the revolution of 1688, it's called the Glorious Revolution. One standard version of this is what happened was the creditors of the government took over the government. And they put in place a set of institutions that were designed to create a government that could tax, spend, and borrow. And it could spend because it could borrow, and it could borrow because it could tax. And associated with this were a set of rearrangements of institutions. Parliament acquired a great deal of power vis-a-vis the king. The old king was one king had his head chopped off, and then his son got kicked out of the country. Didn't have his head kicked out. James II got kicked out of the country. Parliament called in a new king from Holland and imported some of Holland's institutions. So Parliament got the ability to authorize borrowing. You couldn't borrow unless Parliament authorized it. Parliament had the ability both to borrow and to levy the taxes that would service the debt. Another institution that was influential in the United States was the Bank of England was founded in 1694, right after, as part of the Glorious Revolution. The Bank of England was a deal by which big creditors of the government were given a monopoly right to found a bank that could issue notes. They became fiscal agent of the British government, and they, in return for these monopoly rights, they agreed to buy government debt and also to service government debt. Okay, so there was a set of institutions that increased parliamentary power, and here's the consequence of this. A government which was created that could tax, borrow, and spend. And this is a striking, during the 18th century, Britain fought a series of wars against France, and they won all of them except the last. And the last was the American Revolution. And what this graph has is, this is a striking graph. It has total government expenditures in Britain, and it has total government revenues. And those are the two things I want to focus on. And the government expenditures, the big fluctuations in government expenditures, those are the wars. This is the War of Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War here. During these wars, there's a big surge in government expenditures, but there's not a surge in taxes. And what happens is, during peacetime, total government revenues are enough to cover total government expenditures, including interest payments on the debt. And you'll notice interest payments on the debt, non-military expenditures are down here. Non-military expenditures plus interest payments are up here. And you'll notice the lion's share of civil plus debt service is debt service, and it's just heading north. So what happens is, during the war, Britain runs a deficit, and then it raises taxes during and after the war just by enough to service the interest on the debt and roll it over. The debt is not retired. It does not retire the debt. Something Adam Smith complained about, but and that other people celebrated. Alexander Hamilton celebrated it. Did not retire the debt. But the consequence of a war is an increase in taxes by enough to service the increased interest on the debt. And that's what's going on. So during this period, Britain does not default once. It's effectively on a specie or gold standard, and a deal is a deal. This debt that the government pays is it's risk-free. Okay, that's what's going on in Britain, and the way Britain's a small country, it's actually taxing its citizens at rates 2 or 3 times what the French are doing per capita, maybe 3 or 4 times. So it's raising significant revenues. This is a tax spending borrowing machine, and Britain is using. It fights these wars. It often subsidizes foreign governments to supply troops to fight Britain's wars. And if you know anything about American history, it pays it's paying Hessians from the German country of Hesse to come to America and fight against us. Okay, so this is what's going on in Britain. So there were this set of institutional reforms that were very influential. And you could actually think, you could ask, was the Glorious Revolution, how did it fit Milton Friedman's dictum that fiscal crises often lead to constitutional changes? Because there were constitutional changes in 1688, big ones. Well, there were a bunch of fiscal rearrangements, big time, after the Glorious Revolution. It probably wasn't the principal cause. Now, that's what's going on in Britain. Here's what's going on in France. Now, France has a very different set of institutions. It did not have a revolution before 1789. Because of some fires, it has the data are much harder to collect. But Let me show you what the outcomes are. These are total. This is total spending, and the circles are total revenues. And you'll notice total spending is almost always greater than total revenues, except this period right here. Right here. So what's happening is during this period, France, all the period for the 125 years before the French Revolution in 1789, France has a chronic fiscal problem. And what is the nature of that fiscal problem? Okay, it had a very different form of government. It supposedly had what's called the ancient regime. Tocqueville called it that. He wrote a famous book called The Ancient Regime, where he describes French institutions before the revolution. You had a king who was supposedly an absolute monarch. But his power was constrained in many ways. And where he had power about peculiar things, and he didn't have power about other things. So he had very limited ability to affect either government expenditures or taxes. But he could default on debts at his will. He had a great deal of power. There was no parliament that could stop him from defaulting on debts. So he couldn't raise revenues or decrease them. He had very limited effect on spending. And I'm going to explain what the reasons were. So even though he was a so-called absolute monarch, if you go back and look at the history, France did not have a written constitution like England, to my knowledge. It had a set of traditions that were developed. And the way the country, by the way, this isn't all that different from some other countries outside of the United States, because we were formed in a peculiar way. So the way France was created, it grew out of the feudal period where there wasn't a France. There were a bunch of little small city-states and very small countries that had sovereign governments, like Burgundy. Different French provinces had actually been independent countries. And the way the French state was created was a bunch of bargains and deals and marriages. So France, the king of France would acquire a province that had been a country by making a deal. It would guarantee to the local elites in that province that they could keep their own spending and tax arrangements, and the central government in France would not interfere. All that the government would have to do the local government would have to agree to become part of France, get some benefits, let the government of France run its foreign policy. So what happened is by the mid-1770s, all sorts of local elites had deals, and they had exemptions from the central government being able to tax them or regulate them. So the early economists in France, like Turgot and Quesnay, who were basically laissez-faire economists, they hated this system because tax rates varied across provinces drastically, and there were internal tariffs across provinces. It couldn't be a free trade or uniform taxation, and that was because of the way the country had been created. This is kind of the background. So you have a king who's an absolute monarch, but is really heavily constrained. Here's another way he's constrained. This is an ancient institution. The way the king sometimes raised revenues is he did the following. The king was strapped for money, and he wanted to raise revenues. So what he would do is he would sell a government office. That's right. He would sell a judgeship. And let's say you're a rich person and you have a son, or in those days, who you wanted to provide for, a nice job. So what you would do is you would buy the office from the king. So you would give the king a sum of money. This is be written down in a record. And in exchange for that money, it's what this really is. It's a permanent loan to the king. And in exchange for that money, the king will pay an annuity, which is the judge's salary. So, so there's a so-called nobility of the robe. Many of those nobles had bought their offices, and the king owed them. The king technically owed them money, and the interest payments on those obligations were the salaries. So now the king was pretty smart. Sometimes he'd say, if he wanted to raise revenues, he'd say, "Okay, I want to increase the salaries of these judges." Well, that would mean that's a forced loan on the judges. The judges have to put up more money, and he had a limited ability to do that. There was not a parliament. There were many parliaments, and these parliaments were, that's a French word. The parliaments were basically courts that had, often throughout the country, that had the ability to cancel requests of the king for certain kinds of either tax increases or government expenditure decreases. So lots of the expenditures that the king made were for obligations to people to whom he had contractual obligations, and there were courts that stopped him from doing this. So the more you read about this king, he's more and more constrained. There isn't a national parliament that can increase taxes. There is not a national bank. There's not a central bank. Okay, so what's the consequence of this? Okay, so how can the king does have a way to change things. He can call something called, so basically a constitutional convention. The only authority that he has to change these arrangements is something called the Estates General, where the nobility, the nobles, you're a member of one of three estates: the nobles, or the clergy, or the rest of us, the third estate, and those are represented. The last time the States General had met was something like 1613. If the king really wanted to get the authority to cut expenditures or taxes, he could call the Estates General together, and they would have a discussion of how to rearrange things. I'll come back to that in a minute, because that's what kicks off the revolution. Okay, so if we look at this graph, again, we're going to compare this graph with England. This is a striking graph. This actually looks like a simulation of a model of Robert Barrow that I'm going to tell you about. It's a striking model, a striking graph. This doesn't look like that at all. So, these data are imperfect. So if we, and notice it doesn't start earlier because of some, so what happened was in this period, if we go, this is British data, in this period right here, France had come out of the wars of Louis XIV. There was finally peace right here, and France came out with huge government debt, and the graph did not look like this. The revenues were down here, and the expenditures, including the interest payments, were up here. There's this big gap. So, so there was no way of decreasing the government expenditures or increasing the taxes at that time. And at that time, the king was he was a minor, and there was what's called a regent, a custodian, who was taking care of the government for him. And the regent got the idea is that he said, "This is a fiscal crisis. I either have to decrease government expenditures or increase taxes so that I look more like England. And I can't do that because I don't have the power. So what I want to do is have a constitutional convention and I'm going to call the Estates General together to address this fiscal problem, to rearrange things so that we can balance our budget. And the king's prime minister said, if you call the Estates General together, you will have a revolution on your hands. And he advised him instead to default. So what the king did is, the regent did is he defaulted on a substantial amount of the debt. He just wrote down the debt. And then what happened was, so French government debt was not risk-free. In the 18th century, it was characterized by, it claimed to be risk-free, but there were repeated defaults. So the last default, there was a big default in 1775, right before 1775, that brought revenues and spending into line, at least temporarily. And when the new king, there was a new king in 1775, Louis XVI, who was destined to lose his life on the guillotine. He appointed the best economist in France to be his finance minister. And his finance minister told him that, well, because of those defaults, you had brought the total spending, including interest expenditures, just down to where revenues were. But this was a balancing act, and to make this good, to make a promise of no more defaults credible, you could not have any foreign adventures, and you could not have any increase in expenditures. Okay. So what happens is in 1775, that's the beginning of the American Revolution. And France cannot resist the opportunity, the temptation to help the American colonists become free of its enemy. It wants to weaken Britain. And the French government spends substantial revenues, increases its revenues. The reason for this increase in revenues here, increase in expenditures, that's to help the Americans. Partly in a loan, but mostly just in direct payments. So there's an increase in huge increase in French spending. That's all a part of the American Revolution. So the American Revolution is connected. Okay, so during this period, these are pretty good numbers. Revenues look like this, and spendings look like this. And what's happening is interest payments are being made by just borrowing more. So total government debt is heading north. And as a matter of fact, by 1787 or 88, interest payments on the debt are absorbing 50 or 60% of government revenues. And there's still a deficit. Okay, so during this period, there's a sequence of finance ministers, the most brilliant economists in the world. So the King of France is a Catholic. He's sworn to extirpate Protestants. But despite that, he gets one of the best economists in the world, Jacques Necker, who is one of Alexander Hamilton's heroes, to be finance minister. And these best finance ministers tell the king, you've got to reduce revenues, increase revenues or cut expenditures. He does not have the power to do it. This is a striking graph because it shows it shows military expenditures in France and England, and despite the fact that France is a much bigger country, its expenditures are about the same as Britain's. Okay. So just to show you, King got some really good advice. So there's a French civil servant named Montjon in 1770, and he advances the Barrow-Gallatin model that we're going to see. So look at his advice. He says Britain finances taxation neither all nor part of the cost of the war. It finances them by loans. But it increases the annual tax burden only by the amount necessary to face the interest and redemption of the loan. And then he says that's what the regime France has to adopt. And he recommends this. So he says France isn't doing that. In wartime, it increases taxes too much. And that's exactly the worst time to increase taxes, because that's where you want people to have incentives to produce. So this is an early precursor of the Barrow model that we're going to see. So here's a question. France, during the 1780s, France, the King of France is unable to borrow. So during this period, France is trying to borrow, and it tries to place loans. It tries to sell them, and it can't sell them. It's literally in a place where people aren't going to borrow to it. And so the King of France, Louis XVI, asks his finance minister, Necker, in 1784, why it is that he's the most powerful king in Europe, he thinks, but he can't borrow. So here's what he says. This is a remarkable quote. It shows you Necker was a great economist, and he actually anticipated work that two NYU economists got very famous for in the 1980s, 200 years earlier. They put math on this. It's a theory of credibility. So here's what he says. The absolute power of a monarch in full public trust. Okay, he says this in fancy French language, are two notions which need intermediaries to be perfectly conciliated. He means they're in contradiction. Okay, this authority, the king's authority in France, is subject to certain restraints when it comes to an increase in taxes, since the laws which levy new taxes must be registered in the parliaments, those little courts. And those courts can then enlighten the monarch. It's justice. It's very polite language, by their remarks, meaning they'll just tell the king he can't increase taxes. Nevertheless, a simple ministerial order authorized by the sovereign is enough to suspend reimbursements or to impose a reduction in interest. So the king has the authority to default just like that, but he has no authority to increase taxes. So this is a line that Abreu, Pearson, Stucchetti, our colleagues, that encapsulates their theory. Therefore, one can rekindle or sustain public trust only by giving reassurances on the sovereign's intentions and by proving that no motive can incite him to fail his obligations. So think about this, write this down and think about this, because what it says is to have debt that you think is going to be repaid, you have to have a theory about the sovereign government's abilities and incentives to repay it. And it's going to be repaid only if you think it's always in your interest to repay it, that no motive can incite him to fail his obligations. And what Necker's telling him is, you cannot do that because you've defaulted a lot and you're going to have the incentive default, and that's why people won't lend to you. This is Sovereign Debt 101 in 1784. Okay, so that's the situation. So here's the debt service is taking up 70% of French revenues. Okay, we've got some data on tax collections per capita. Okay, so now we get to the intriguing thing. Now, I am not an historian, but if you were a historian, the gold standard of a problem in history, that if you could crack this problem, if you could answer this question decisively, you would have a very important book in history. So here's the question. in 1788, the king, faced with these problems, decides to call the Estates General together to reform the fiscal constitution. He does it because there's a debt crisis and he can't borrow any more money, but he has to borrow because he's spending more than he can tax. He can't reduce expenditures. Every time he tries to do it, he gets in tremendous trouble from the stakeholders. He can't increase taxes because he doesn't have the authority. Okay. Now he can default, but like he did in 1718, when the advisor to the king told him, if you call the Estates General together, you're going to have a revolution in your hands, so you better default. This time, the King of France does not default. He does not want to default. And he calls the Estates General together to rewrite the fiscal constitution of France. And they rewrite it with big consequences. So I want to tell you how they rewrite that fiscal constitution and what some of the things they did, because they performed experiments which are interesting to compare to American experiments, and they're just they're wonderful experiments in monetary and fiscal history. So here we go. The French Revolution starts in the spring of 1789. Okay, so there's a book you can read about this. It's a very controversial book called Citizens by Simon Schama, who describes some of the events. But I think some of his interpretations are, I'll tell you what Simon Schama says. He says, the question is, he addresses this issue, and in effect he addresses it. Okay, he asks the question, why couldn't the French, following question, this is about institutions and policies. He says France had these fiscal crises in the 1780s because they had a bunch of bad policy makers and bad policy decisions. He said it was feasible for them to do just like England did, but they chose not to do it because they were dopes. That's what he says. And that's the first third of his book. And he, okay, so the counter argument to that is, well, were they dopes? Look at this tax smoothing advice. Look at the finance minister discussing this with the king. Look at the pattern of constraints, institutional constraints. France was subject to the rule of law. They had all these contracts. They had these courts that were enforcing this. They didn't have an absolute monarch. It was constrained by a host of sources. They had a constitution that, if the counter argument is, if you think about this constitution as setting a list of who can choose what, when, and timing protocols, under this constitution, you could have the best, most sincere, well-motivated people, and you were going to get these outcomes. Because the equilibrium under this constitution was you were going to have a continuing fiscal crisis. And the only way to fix it was to change institutions. That's the counter argument. So Simon Schama doesn't state the counter argument, but I'm stating it. But if you read that, I was reading that book, and I read it at night before I went to sleep, and my wife would say, if this book annoys you so much, why do you keep reading it? But anyway, okay. So there's a fiscal crisis, and the Estates General is called together. Okay, so I'm going to give you what a macroeconomist's view of the French Revolution is, including the guillotine. Okay, so here's the deal. So France has this big debt problem, and it also has, as part of the ancient institution, it has three estates: the church, the nobles, who can't be taxed because they had these deals when their ancestors joined the king, France, to become part of France. The church was exempt from taxes. It went way back. The church owned maybe about 20% of the income-producing property in France. In addition to churches, it owned farms and so on, and leased those farms and had revenues. The church was very wealthy. Okay, and furthermore, someone had done a calculation about the capitalized value of the income-producing property of church lands in France. And guess what? The capitalized value of that was approximately equal to the total debt owed by the King of France. Just an interesting fact. Okay, the value of that church land, which is owned by the church, and the church is using those revenues for whatever purposes it has. Okay, so the French Revolution begins with this. They didn't call it the French Revolution then, of course. It's just a meeting of the Estates General. Okay, so what happens is in one of the first meetings of the Estates General, there's a bishop, and his name is Talleyrand. He's a bishop in the Catholic Church. Turns out he's an atheist. He's from a prominent family whose profession is to be a cleric. So he's a bishop, which is a high position. He actually, at one point, he's told he has to say mass, and I don't think he's ever been to one. He somehow evades this. So he's an atheist. But he is a member of the Estates General representing the church. And Talleyrand, go look him up on Google. He's a fascinating figure. He rises in the Estates General and he says that the church has more than enough property to service the needs of God, as he puts it. And he makes a proposal that what should happen, the way France should address the debt problem so it can honor the debts to its creditors, is it should nationalize the church lands and then sell them off as a way of servicing the government debt. There's a debate on this, and it's overwhelmingly carried that these church lands will be nationalized because who would if a bishop in the church is for it, and it must be okay. So there was also a very anti-clerical element of the French Revolution. So the church is and to this day the elements of the church in France are very against the consequences of the revolution. So this church is nationalized. Now, this land is nationalized. Now, actually, another part of the history of the French Revolution is the Marxists got a hold of the historiography of the French Revolution, and they viewed this as an early proto communist grab of stuff. That this was a precursor of what Lenin did and Stalin did, but that's really a misreading of history because it neglects a bunch of things. The people who did this were laissez-faire, free market economists who had an agenda, which is looks more like the agenda of, say Governor Romney, who ran for president in 2012. It's a free market, reduce regulation, let markets work. So these people who were a dominant force in the in the National Assembly, their vision is this: they want to reform French institutions to make them look more like British institutions, and they want to rationalize the tax system. They want to have a uniform taxation throughout the country. They want to have, they don't want to have every province setting its own tax rate. They want to abolish internal tariffs. They want free markets to work. They want to undercut monopolies. So these are classical liberals. So those are the people who nationalize this land. So they do not want this land to be the property of the government. So what they want to do is they want to redistribute this land. So here's what they do. They do this fascinating experiment. Now, where'd they get this experiment from? Well, turns out many of them had read Adam Smith, which was written in 1776. And remember that little experiment I told you about, where Adam Smith said, suppose you were on a species standard, a silver standard, and what you did is you had a government that, it's a small open economy. It's a government. What it does is it issues paper currency that's convertible into silver. Smith described how to do that. And then what he predicted was that currency could trade 1-for-1 for silver, and it could substitute for silver. So the French had read that and understood it and thought they had an improvement on it. So here's what they did. Here's what the scheme is. What they're going to do is they're going to nationalize the church land. That's what they did. Now the government owns it, but the government doesn't want to keep it. It wants to use it to service the debt. So what it does is it takes the land and it issues pieces of paper, which I'm going to show you. Uh-oh. I want to take a 3-minute break where I do a slide correction. Is it okay? So we're going to have a so I'm going to basically stop now. I'm going to tell you where I'm going to begin next time. Is I'm going to tell you what France does with these lands. And here's basically what they do. They issue pieces of paper called the assignat. An assignat, it's denominated in livres, which is a silver currency. So it's supposed to be it's just a piece of paper. It's got the king's name on it. And what it says is this piece of paper is acceptable at par, 1-for-1 with silver currency, at an auction of church lands. So what the government's going to do is it's going to issue these. It's going to do two things. It's going to issue these pieces of paper, and it's going to use them to pay bills. It's going to pay interest on its debt. It might buy some of the debt back. It's going to pay civil servants and soldiers. It's going to buy stuff that the government uses with these pieces of paper. So these pieces of paper are going to be out there. What can you do with the piece of papers? Well, first, they could be circulating. But then the thing that you can do is the second thing the government's going to do, it's going to hold an auction of church lands. And the auction's going to be done in a sophisticated way. Remember, the church land, it's not a church. It's a piece of income-producing property. It's got a rental stream. So what the government's going to do is it's going to hold that auction, and you can use these assignats to buy the church land. And then what it's going to do is the assignats that have been collected from the church land, it's going to burn them. So it's going to issue the pieces of paper. It's going to hold an auction. It's going to get the pieces of paper back, and it's going to burn the land. It's going to burn the paper. So except for the ones that are just going to be circulating, it's it's going to be an increase in this paper, which is backed by these church lands. That's the scheme. It was inspired by, it's a variation and an improvement on the Adam Smith scheme. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you how that worked. And did it work for a while? Did it work forever? That's where we're going to go. So I think I'm out of time. So I'm going to, unless there's questions, I'm going to stop. Okay, so
we have one final question.
Okay.
It's a small question. So, how do we ask questions outside class?
Just repeat that. Just repeat that.
Ask questions outside class.
How do you ask questions outside class?
Yes.
Oh,
outside of class?
Yeah, what's the best way to contact you, Tom?
Oh, the first thing is to initiate it, send me an email or send George an email, and I will respond. And I'll set up a way that's convenient for you to ask questions. We could either have a Zoom meeting or a Skype meeting, or that's what we're going to do it. I'm also happy to hold. I'm actually hold scheduled office hours. My experience is that those don't work because I just sit there and no one ever comes in. So I prefer to have you email me, and we'll set up a time that's convenient for you for us to talk. Okay? Okay, I'll see you next week.
See you, Tim.
Bye.